All right, so let's talk about validity. Validity is the appropriateness of the choices that you make as a researcher. So when we are specifically talking about measurement validity, we are interrogating the validity of our measures. So there's a couple different types of construct or of validity as it relates to measurement. So we're going to be looking at construct validity, which is how well you operationalized your variables. So you start with this abstract variable that you're interested in, let's say depression, and you have to operationalize it. You have to create a very clear, concrete, technical definition that is appropriate for your study. So there's a couple different ways you can assess construct validity. So the first is by looking at it and having an expert be like, that looks right. That's face validity. So on the face of the measurement, it looks right. So if you're measuring depression and depressive levels, if your questions are about mood and lack of attention and sadness and lack of motivation, then on the face, it's valid. But that's just a subjective way, and it can differ between different researchers and different people. The second way is also very subjective, is content validity. Content validity says that the measure contains all parts of your that your theory says it should contain. So if you are operating from the theory of like the DSM-5 definition of depression, then it needs to include all of the areas of that theory. So that theory in the DSM-5, it does include things. It's not just mood, but it's like a length of time. So it has to be like 2 weeks or longer of this depressive episode multiple times over the course of 6 months. And you have to feel like you have to like hit a certain level of like, it's like you have to have 7 of 12 of these symptoms checked off. So a content valid survey measurement for depression is going to have all parts of that. It's going to address all parts of that theory. So it's going to have questions about lack of motivation and difficulty focusing on attention and not finding joy in things that normally cause you joy, not sleeping or sleeping too much. It's going to cover all of that. And that doesn't mean like you have to have, perfect 7s on every single measure. It's more of like a composite, like, do you hit a certain threshold? Do you hit this certain, when you add the scores together for all these questions, does it push over that baseline for depression, as, maybe a therapist would also diagnose for. So that's face validity, content validity. They're very subjective. More objective ways of assessing validity in as you are operationalizing variables. First is criterion validity. So when you are interested in criterion validity, you are assessing, you're actually taking measurements for whether your measure is correlated with a relevant behavioral outcome. So if you are interested in, assessing the criterion validity of, say, the Beck Depression Inventory, depression is associated with depressed mood, which is associated with like negative affect. So a good depression inventory should be correlated with a similar with the behavior of, having depressed mood. Those should be highly associated. If you saw them on a scatter plot, it would probably be positive. So, you have like on the x-axis, you have the depression inventory, Beck depression inventory, and on the y-axis, you have the positive and negative affect scale, and lower levels of depression should correlate with, I guess that would be negative. It depends on how PANAS is measured, but I do believe a higher score means positive. So actually that should be negative association. So the higher your PANAS, which is positive and negative affect scale, so the higher your mood, the lower your depressive levels. So that is criterion validity. So it's measuring a similar irrelevant behavioral outcome. Those behavioral outcomes could be other things as well. Let's say, like GPAs tend to drop when people are depressed. So if you're feeling not very motivated to go to school and your GPA drops, well, higher levels of depression, lower levels of GPA scores, that can be one of those associations that is, if it's highly correlated, if it's close to 1, so say the correlation's about a 0.7 for GPA and this depression scale, then you have pretty high criterion validity. Next, we have convergent and discriminate validity. These are related to criterion validity, but not quite the same. So convergent validity, if they converge, that means your self-report measure is more strongly associated with self-report measures of similar constructs. So instead of like observing the behavior, if you have people measure these two different constructs, the Beck Depression Inventory and, some other related construct, then if they're highly associated, your correlation R equals close to 0.1 or close to -1, not -1, close to 1 or -1, then it'll have high convergent validity. So the higher levels of depression should be associated with similar constructs, self-report scales for, things like PANAS, depressed mood, as well as maybe like an attention score or like a reaction time score. So when people are depressed, their reaction time's actually slow. It's like living, like slowed down. So if you are measuring, these similar sort of self-report constructs, then it'll be convergent validity. And finally, we have discriminate validity, which means that your self-report measure is less strongly associated with self-report measures of dissimilar constructs. So probably if you are more depressed, the more depressed you are, it shouldn't probably be associated with your a dissimilar construct would be like how depression is related to a lot of things, so this got a little hard all of a sudden. No, I got this. Hold on. Discriminate validity should be associated with things like, or should not be associated with something like, your acceptance of technology scale or scores. Acceptance of technology and your depression levels, not really related. So they probably shouldn't correlate highly. You should probably have an R closer to 0 for those. And that is discriminate validity. It's like basically helps figure out that you're not measuring something else that's unrelated. Hope that helps.